Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this seminar, one in the series that we have started in April 2020. And we have run something like 100 webinars since then. I have the pleasure of welcoming everyone and our special guest, our speaker today, Professor Tim Devaney from Manchester Alliance Business School. On the topic of populism, the rise of populism. Before we get to our conversation with Professor Devini, just some housekeeping notes. I'm, first of all, Tamer Çavuşgil at Georgia State University Cyber. We are offering this series, webinar series, on behalf of several other cybers, and we are happy to acknowledge them as well. You saw the list earlier on the panel on one of the slides. Uh, the These cyber webinar series are recorded and will become available to you in a day or so on our GSU-CIBER website, as well as our cyber's pages on YouTube as well. So if you missed some of it, or if you'd like to share this conversation with your students or others, you'll be able to see those on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. Uh, when you exit, you will also receive a brief questionnaire in your email box. Please respond to that. 5 short questions about your response to this particular conversation, and also suggestions for future topics and future speakers. We are very interested in any feedback you may be able to offer. Everyone except the panelists is muted in this webinar, and we encourage questions and comments. Tim and I will monitor that and will try to respond to you. And I think then we can get going with the topic. So, as I mentioned, the topic is very popular, especially in recent years, has been made even more popular as we have seen leaders and political parties move towards a much more populist approach, a political orientation or stance that appeals to common people, ordinary people, in perhaps in opposition to the perceived elite or educated class, so-called the establishment. And this may reflect some degree of aloofness, apathy, a sense of somewhat being deprived of the right to vote, for example, to govern or to lead. So momentum is clearly on the populist side in recent years. Populist regimes have thrived in elections in recent years. We've seen this in India, Indonesia, Mexico, Turkey, and in Europe as well, Italy, Austria, Hungary, and so on. I noticed the other day a recent poll, a survey that indicated that some 41% of European voters age 18 to 35 have moved to the right or far right. So it's certainly an important topic that we'd like to discuss. And we have our very good colleague, international business professor Tim Devaney, with us to talk about perhaps a clearer perspective on the nature of the populist movement, populist wave of the last decade, and a better understanding of how companies have reacted, have addressed this issue, and will continue to do that. And an understanding of how the political structure of different countries can influence their susceptibility to the influence of fringe political ideologies. So we'll talk a little bit about with Tim about the origins of populist movement as well, because it's not necessarily new, even though we have seen it accentuated way in recent years. Let me say a couple of things. I can take an hour to introduce our distinguished guest today, Professor Timothy Devaney. But very briefly, he is the professor and chair of international business at the Alliance Manchester Business School at the University of Manchester. Before, he served at very prestigious universities such as Leeds University, just immediately before Manchester, as the professor and university leadership chair, and also Pro-Dean of Research and Innovation. He was at Macquarie University in Australia, as well as Australian Graduate School of Management. I think, Tim, I met you first when you were at AGSM back in Australia. And you have also taught at the University of Chicago, Vanderbilt University, UCLA, and also visited many universities such as Copenhagen Business School, Humboldt University, Berlin, VU, University of Hamburg, and Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and many others. Tim is a prolific researcher, not only a good educator and teacher, but he has published more than a dozen books and more than 100 articles in leading journals, journals such as Management Science, Journal of Business, the Academy of Management Review, GIBS, Journal of International Business Studies, Organization Science, California Management Review, and many others. And Tim has also presented papers, addressed at something like more than 200 universities and conferences around the world over the last decade. He has many accolades, recipient of in management in 2008 of the Alexander von Humboldt and Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Fellow. He's a fellow of the AIB, fellow of the EBA, European International Business Academy, Academy of Management, Academy of Social Sciences, a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and also Academy of Management's Impact Practice Award recipient. So there's a lot that obviously he's been distinguished, bestowed with, given his very important works. He is on the editorial board of more than a dozen leading journals, and taught in executive programs around the world as well. So he's a popular speaker, certainly. But Tim, you are joining us in your afternoon time from Manchester, UK. Thank you so much for accommodating us, and look forward to our conversation. I guess a good place to start, don't you think, would be sort of your reflections on the populism, the rise of populism, what it means, and then we can get into hopefully a little bit of, you mentioned in our earlier conversation that this is not necessarily a recent movement. It goes way back, especially in places like Latin America. We've seen these trends. So let me give you a chance to, first of all, welcome again. Let me give you a chance to get started. And then I encourage everyone, I think I did that already, but just in case, if you have questions, comments, please post them at the Q&A function, better than the chat function. So thank you again, Tim.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Tamara. It's really an honor to be presenting to this group today. Yeah, I think the thing that I've always found fascinating about populism is the fact that in many ways it isn't new. In fact, it goes back, in particular, there were heavy waves of populism in the 19th century, all the way through the 20th century. It wasn't just Latin America. The United States in particular has had a long history of populist influence in terms of not only presidential politics, but politics at local levels. You've seen it in Germany and France, even in the 1950s, in Germany, certainly in the 1930s, but also in other periods of time. You've seen it in Italy, and you've seen it in Poland, you've seen it in many places. and many leaders that would not otherwise be considered to be initially thought about as populist have many of the characteristics that take on that really are reflected in populist thinking. So there's a big difference between populists as leaders, so an individual embodying things which would be considered to be kind of part of a populist agenda, and populist political parties, or kind of whole coalitions of groups that are able to uh, push a broader agenda that may actually get them into power in some material way. So there is this aspect of populism, I think, which isn't new, and we can talk about this in a bit more, because I can give you a lot of really good examples of this, particularly in the United States. But also the fact that really what you're looking at when you see populist movements arise, and they can arise on the left and on the right. In fact, most of 19th century populism, early 20th century populism, was primarily on the left. And what we've seen more recently is a bit more of the populist of the right. Although someone like Mussolini would also be an example of populism on the right. And we've seen in Latin America populism on the right and populism on the left. So the recent phenomenon is much more populism on the right. But this idea that populism and right-wing politics go hand in hand, that isn't necessarily true. We've seen big waves of populism on the left of the political spectrum and big waves of populism on the right of the political spectrum. And they've had differential aspects in terms of the nature of their influence. But the one thing that does stand out around populism is that you can think about it in a couple different ways. One of which is the most obvious for recent phenomenon, which is around the economic kind of rationales or underlying populism, which has to do with disaffected groups that feel they have been left behind. And those groups are not simply groups which are materially kind of in the short term losing out on something, but that they feel that they've materially been held back over a considerable period of time. And they then voice that in some material way, or political parties take advantage of the fact that this disaffection is there, and they can somehow pull together a political coalition which allows them to be able to take advantage of that. But there are also a kind of more ideological views that are related to populism, and this is what you saw a bit with Mussolini, a bit with Hitler, a bit with Lenin and others, kind of the more left-wing populism, and that was that there's kind of a materiality of kind of there are good groups of people and there are bad groups of people, and the good groups of people are on our side, and the bad groups of people are the people who are on the other side. Therefore, it becomes much more of a kind of ideological, cultural phenomenon. But it's also, can be thought about in a much more almost institutional way, where a lot of the communistic populism that arose after 1848 and then kind of pushing all the way through into the 20th century, and obviously was the biggest materiality of that was initially in Russia, where it's really a more of a sustained political movement that really mobilizes these marginal classes, provides leadership to them. They don't necessarily in and of themselves have the capability of doing this, but it becomes a mobilization effort. And in the case of Russia, of course, that occurs without any voting, right? That doesn't occur because people are doing what you might see in Italy or the United States or in Germany or France or other countries. It was actually a mobilization of these disaffected masses who were willing to sort of kind of get on side with opposition to the established order, because the established order wasn't doing anything for them. And so that aspect of it also comes out. So what you see this notion that Chris Hartwell and I talk about, which is this notion of varieties of populism, that there's a tendency at times to talk about populism and think about it as a singular definitional identity, right? That there's something about it which is uniform and consistent, but it isn't. It actually is kind of a bit more of a mixture of different things, which causes groups which might be on the margin politically to potentially find a way of either being mobilized by a leadership or themselves kind of organizing or reflecting themselves in kind of voting patterns, which lead to specific types of outcomes. So it's a
Fascinating.
very broad type of way of thinking about it.
Yeah, really fascinating, very topical as well in our in our world currently. But is I think about this alienation by the masses, disenfranchisement, and somehow restless people
Mm.
becoming larger in numbers. I'm thinking, if we think about the current rise of populism, is it also, do you think, due to the disruptions that we have seen, major disruptions economically, technologically, tensions between governments and so on? So there's a lot more going on in societies that perhaps make people turn against the ruling group, perhaps. Do you think that's part of it? What will be the causes of the current phase of the rise of populism?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is going to be the case that you're always going to have some group of disaffected individuals in the society, right? There's always going to be kind of some marginal populist group who are going to be marginalized in any society, right? The real question is how big they are and how cohesive they are in terms of the nature of the way in which they utilize their, let's say, their voting power or their economic power or their, around their labor, as an example. Which was in the United States and many countries, after the Industrial Revolution and then into the late 1890s, a lot of it was around labor. And that was a disaffected group, right? And that was the group that was sort of doing it. But I think that recently the question would be, well, look, why do people become disaffected? Right, which is kind of independent of populism in of itself. And it's clear that what the statistics show that there have been more significant losers from things like technology development and globalization than would otherwise be expected. In other words, we're international business professors. We push the globalization agenda, but the distribution of the benefits of that globalization agenda have not been uniform. And also the technology agenda, which also, economists and management scholars and others would say, the technology development is a good thing. But the real question, of course, is technology development always has losers, or always has somebody who's established in the existing structures that are going to be upset by technology developments. And I think that in the case of globalization, in the case of technology development, you have these two things merging at a specific point in time. Okay, it isn't the only underlying factor, right? But these two things merge at the same time. They then have their own kind of residual effects on individuals because the movements towards kind of populist leadership or populist parties in many countries isn't a 5-year phenomenon. It isn't even a 10-year phenomenon, right? It's more of a 20, 30-year phenomenon. In other words, it's a generational group or groups of kind of overlapping generations who sort of say, well, this isn't really working for me. This isn't as, the existing structures aren't really progressing me in terms of the nature of the life I want or the life I want for my children or my family or my community. And therefore that then creates kind of little festering aspects of this, right? And then if you get external pressures, which might arise, let's say climate change might be one of those, right? Things occur in terms of, immigration, which might otherwise be sustainable under certain sets of circumstances, become a flashpoint, right? They may in and of themselves be a reflection of the problem, but they also simply may be a flashpoint associated with the problem. Because anti-immigration sentiments have existed, for centuries. That's nothing new, right? But the real question is, how do they all mix? In other words, you get a bit of a perfect storm of a different set of things where you've got disaffected groups, you've got a couple flashpoints, which all of a sudden start things, and then things sort of take on a bit of a dynamic life of their own, and then you start to find yourself in something of an uncontrollable situation. From the standpoint of the established political parties and maybe the established institutions as well. They just don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah. So the so-called left behind phenomenon, it's easy to happen in recent years. But your point about the slow brewing nature of the populist tendencies, I think is also very right. It may also be a generational thing, slowly larger groups of people coming to the understanding that they are left behind
Yeah.
and they're not benefiting from the fruits of their labor. Somehow they are marginalized. So
Yeah.
that's kind of and then when that group becomes a large group and finds a political party that represents their interests, all of a sudden things change. There's one question from one of our participants, Tim. Is populism a symptom of broader systemic failures? I mean, so obviously that has to do with as well. I mean, if the current ruling regime, is not necessarily listening or sensitive to the needs of this larger groups of people in the society, then there's going to be noises, don't you think?
Yeah, I think there are two parts to that. I think one part of that is if you look, for example, in the United States, many of the people obviously in this seminar would be from the United States. One of the things that is very interesting is if you look at many of the populist, um, individuals who were sort of really high on populism, right? The William Jennings Bryan, the Theodore Roosevelts, for example, their agendas can get subsumed by existing parties. This is what happened with Father Coughlin and FDR in the 1930s, 1940s. It was what happened with George Wallace in the 1960s, with Nixon sort of kind of taking a lot of kind of Wallace's steam away. And it occurred later on, with the Ross Perot's and the Tea Party and a lot of other groups where the Republican Party was able to kind of pull in some of the underlying agendas. The real issue then becomes an issue of the leadership of the opposition parties, right? In other words, that these parties who are the opposite or the opposition to kind of the populist leaders or a populist movement arising, how can they internalize this disaffection? And I think that one of the things that you've seen in the United States in particular, but you've seen it in a number of other countries as well, particularly Italy, I think is another really good example where this occurs. That what the existing party system is not able to, for lack of leadership or lack of strategy or whatever, they simply are not capable of being able to internalize these other parts of their the competition's agenda, right? Because you can do one of two things, right? You can fight the opposition head to head, and say we're different and they're different, but we're better, and hope that it comes out. But the savvy political structures will typically try to divide and conquer these marginal parties, subsume bits and pieces of them. Now, in parliamentary systems, they subsume them sometimes by bringing them into power. But in systems like in the United States, it isn't a parliamentary system, and therefore you're not going to have that as an option. Okay, and so it becomes a much messier or much harder thing to do for these populist groups to gain power. So the more interesting thing in the United States is how, at least at the national level, more of a populist agenda has been able to capture the GOP, as opposed to kind of doing what you would see in Italy or other places, Poland or Germany, where they try to move, they come in as a coalition partner, and therefore they're kind of they get into their agenda in there, because the goal of many of these populist leaders isn't necessarily to win power. Nigel Farage in the UK, it wasn't that he wanted to win power; he wanted his policies to be implemented. And if he can get his policies implemented and still be out of power, that's actually a win for them. That still keeps them in the game. So they don't necessarily have to acquire power to have their agenda being taken over. And I think one of the failures is that the mainstream political parties haven't simply been able in many of these countries to do that in a very effective way, to neutralize some of the longer term impacts of the disaffection that's out there.
One of our a very good attempt, very, very interesting. One of our participants is thinking about the dichotomy that maybe that we see now in a much more prominent way in the US in terms of income inequity,
Yeah.
and also inequity perhaps in opportunity, access to opportunities. So she's talking about, do you think the populism, which seems to be what happened to the recent elections in the US, could it be the widening gap between the rich and the poor? I mean, do you think that's been a factor?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it's the rich and the poor. Um, and what I think it is it's those who can take advantage of opportunity and those who can't. And that's why if you look, for example, say you take Germany or you take Italy and you compare it to the United States, and you sort of say, okay, well, where is the more populist side of the political spectrum getting its support? Yeah, it's getting its support from individuals who have lower incomes, but that's because they have lower education. That's because they live in areas that are more likely to be affected by, for example, urban agglomeration effects, which we talk about in international business, right? In other words, technology development doesn't occur in rural areas, right? It occurs in agglomerations. Okay, so it occurs in Silicon Valley. It occurs, in kind of the
Boston
industrial
and so
heartland between
on. Yeah.
Munich and Frankfurt and Hamburg, right? It occurs in Milan and northern Italy, and that's actually one of the big divides that you see. And in fact, if you looked and you said in Germany, where do the populists seem to get influence? They get influence in the more rural, old DDR, the German Democratic Republic. Okay, that's where they get it. Where does the power of the populist in Italy come from? It's primarily rural and south. Where does the populist agenda, or in this case, the GOP, get it's in actually rural areas. Even if you took states that Trump won, Pennsylvania, right, where I grew up, where did he win? He didn't win in Pittsburgh. He didn't win in Harrisburg. He didn't win in Philadelphia, and he kind of was even in Erie, right? Everywhere else was red. In Illinois, it was all Cook County and Lake County. It was all the Chicago urban area, and then the rest of the state. Okay, and so that phenomenon is identical, believe it or not, to William Jennings Bryan, and where he basically won rural states, and McKinley and his other competitors won urban and northeastern industrial states. Okay, the difference now is that many of these kind of former industrial areas are no longer big agglomerations, right? And therefore they fall back into these groupings. And this, so I think the real big difference is that those who have locational and educational advantages are the big winners from globalization and technology development, right? They're the ones who are able to get, to get into the universities and really capitalize on skill development. And in these other areas, and in groups within the general community who don't have those opportunities are looking at this and sort of saying, well, this isn't really working for me. Okay, and this is why, for example, you also in every country you also have a big divide between men and women, just like you had in the United States. Same's true in Germany. Same's true in Italy. Okay, in other words, women tend not to buy into the populist agenda to the extent that men do, and particularly men with lower educations and older men. Okay, and they're the disaffected groups. So I would say income appears to be an effect, but income is actually not the effect. The effect is deeper with respect to this access to really developing capabilities and skills and things of that nature.
Yeah, very good. I think I certainly agree with you, Tim. Recently, I read a paper, an essay by David Brooks in The Atlantic, where he talks about, he puts blame on the educational system going back to 1930s, Ivy League schools, Harvard and MITs and Yales and so on. Basically, using in admissions policies, IQ, GPA, SAT kinds of scores, the basically indicators of human ability, and over time creating this meritocracy, the educated class, the elite class versus the working class. And he makes a passionate argument for, this was the wrong thing to happen, because when we look at what the society needs, it's not just, very intelligent, smart people, but also people with, curiosity, graduates of these schools with curiosity, passion, agility, resilience, team skills, etc. So what do you think about that? I mean, we've seen, these so-called Ivy League schools still persisting in
Mhm.
terms of admissions and contributing to this dichotomy that we see, and
Yeah,
then maybe contributing to this rise of populism
yeah.
also.
Yeah, I mean, I will point out that David Brooks is a University of Chicago graduate, so but he's not necessarily philosophically a University of Chicago graduate, I guess, in some ways. I think that's a little bit of kind of blame deflection, to be perfectly honest, because the reality is that the Ivy League schools do tend to dominate in certain sorts of areas. Particularly, for example, the Supreme Court. So the court system tends to be, very much driven by, Ivy League schools in that regard. But I think when you look across the board, I think that in and of itself isn't, that's kind of trying to identify, somebody that you can throw a brick at, rather than recognizing that, particularly in something like the United States, that the elites at state level, the elites across the country, are not coming from these Ivy League schools. But what they are doing is they are coming from universities. Now, having said that, I would make one point which I do think is kind of fairly clear, and that is that the U.S. educational system is very top heavy in the sense that the university, it has outstanding universities, but at the local levels, it is a very broad mixture from very bad, to very good. Okay, and that's not what you see in many, would be considered to be more stable countries in terms of the nature of the wealth distributions that you would look at, right? So the United States isn't like France, where everybody is kind of, everybody in the elite is kind of an École Polytechnique graduate, right? That they're coming out of this system which generates the civil service, in that regard. So I think that I think he's wrong by putting the blame there. I think the problem, it's why I go back and say this is a problem that has existed, is percolated, over very long periods of time. I think that the problem in the United States is fundamentally at lower levels of education. And that is that the way for example, I grew up in an extraordinarily poor family in the inner city of Pittsburgh, where if you went out the back door of my house, it was a steel fabricating plant. Okay, I lived right along the Allegheny River. I didn't have a bedroom until I was 14 years old. Yet I got into Carnegie Mellon University. Then I got into the University of Chicago, right? And I got scholarships, and I got all sorts of things paid for, right? So but I'm not a black individual or Hispanic individual with a single mother. Okay, I mean, I had a good kind of core family environment, which was very different, even though none of those individuals in my family, all the way through my grandparents and that way, were really educated. So I think that that it's that equality at the lower levels which ensures that that meritocracy works higher up. Okay, and so I think there's that aspect of it. In other words, how do you get the grassroots educational structure in the United States to be one where it provides level opportunities for people to go to the next stage, and then that has level opportunities for people to go to the next stage after that. So I think that's part of it. The Ivy League in and of itself has serious issues with related to things like legacy emissions and other sorts of things like that, which leads to a very specialized group of individuals from very specific locations with very specific backgrounds and very specific heritages of their parents, independent of their ethnic background, independent of their religion, independent of everything else. Okay, they have distinctive opportunities that nobody else has. And I think that in and of itself is something that, from an educational standpoint, has to be really thought about. But the diffuse education structure in the United States makes it very, very hard to get coordinated action, towards those sorts of things.
Fascinating. Tim, maybe perhaps we can turn to the implications of the rise of populism to the business community, in particular, multinationals. And there's one question in that regard from Mohammed Genawi, saying that should populism be treated differently, conceptually and or empirically, to other risks in organizations in global expansion? So to the multinational, what does it mean, and how do they address the rise of populism? What's in it for them?
Yeah, I mean, part of the issue that you have with populist is that unlike traditional political structures, like you see in the United States, right? One party wins, another party loses. In the UK, we had the Tories in for 10 years. We're going to have the Labour Party in for 10 years, right? Before the Tories, we had Labour in with Tony Blair for 10 years. The problem that the populists have is that it's very hard to come in with an agenda of destruction or an agenda of, kind of, wealth redistribution or whatever. And do that with the institutions that existed before. And so that's one of the reasons why you would see, in Poland, as an example, they go after the judiciary. In Hungary, they go after the judiciary, right? In Turkey, they go after the judiciary, right? And in the United States, they go after, the judiciary as well. So the populists, because they are such a fringe group and typically don't find their way into power. They're a bit like dogs chasing a car, and all of a sudden they finally caught the car. They have to change the institutional structures that are more amenable to them. And what that means is for companies which have grown up and adapted and know how to operate within the existing political structures, they're now facing a set of circumstances in which the normal levers of influence that the companies would utilize to interact with the political and governmental structure that they have in front of them potentially gets really upset. And Chris Hartwell and I recently published a paper in Business and Society. And one of the things that we looked at is what happens to companies' sort of CSR spending or CSR agenda when a populist party gets into power. And what you find that actually the CSR stuff declines. Okay, so you would expect in the United States all the woke sort of things would disappear pretty quickly from the company's agendas, and then the company starts to align itself with the political structure that it finds itself facing. Okay, so and we saw some of this in the United States where companies started to unwind some of their ESG or DI type of programs in anticipation that potentially these things are going to cause them problems from a political standpoint. So from that aspect of things, the populists want to capture economic rents. They want to capture what it is that they can potentially utilize. And therefore they're going to try to pull those closer to the agenda of that political orientation, that political party, or that group. So typically you see this as a phenomenon which is occurring, which means that as a multinational, you're looking at this, or even as a local company, you're looking at this and sort of saying, well, is it worthwhile fighting town hall? Is it worthwhile pushing against the agenda that's going to be the agenda that's going to operate for the next 4 years or 5 years, or depending on whatever it is that you're facing? Now, is that new to multinationals? Not really. But it does highlight the fact, though, that from a stakeholder perspective, one of the biggest problems that companies have is when they've got stakeholder conflicts. In other words, that this stakeholder group and that stakeholder group are diametrically opposed in terms of the agenda they want to follow, which means that there's no room for negotiation between those groups. For multinationals have to deal with wide varieties of countries, wide varieties of political structures. If everybody was kind of on the globalization bandwagon, everybody was on the free trade bandwagon, everybody was on sort of the equal rights bandwagon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that's easy. Okay. Then all of a sudden you have, one of your key markets going off in this direction, and another one of your key markets going off in this direction. You now have this dilemma. And this dilemma is, how can I, as a singular entity, as a multinational corporation, deal with these completely divergent agendas? Which side do I choose? Whereas before you can sort of kind of sit in the middle and negotiate around the margins. Now it becomes really clear. You've got to choose a side. And that's a real problem for It's a real problem for the multinationals. For local companies, they don't have any other place to go. They've got to get with the plot. But for the multinationals, it starts to create this dilemma that says this is not going to be easy for us to do, because if we bow to this power, or to this god over here, this god over here and this power over here is actually we're going to be their enemy. Okay, so it really becomes a much more difficult dilemma in terms of it. So it isn't about kind of finding the middle, making compromises and negotiating. It then becomes about making really hard choices. Do we align with this political philosophy, or do we kind of align with town hall and take the penalties associated with going against the mainstream agenda?
That does create a dilemma for the multinationals, doesn't it? You actually answered one question that Dominic Berger asked about CSR and the relationship between CSR spending and by companies and populism trends. So that was good. I think he got that from your earlier comments on your research that looked at so many companies' CSR spending. One other question from Hadi Zera. How can populism theories help us understand two emerging phenomena in IB, the rise of friendshoring in global supply chains and the evolving business-state relationships exemplified by the Musk-Trump dynamic? What are their implications for global business in the post-Trump era? So there's several questions there, but
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, there are a couple big ones there. I mean, I think there's a difference between the alignment of kind of big businesses towards kind of corporate outcome. Because the opposite of this that you might consider would be Teddy Roosevelt, okay, who had a populist agenda, but it was very much an anti-business populist agenda. Okay. And one of the things that Chris and I do in one of our papers, I can't remember which one it was, is we actually ask the question, is populism anti-business? Okay, or is it pro? And you see that some populists have kind of more of a pro-business agenda. And in some sense, Xi Jinping, believe it or not, he actually comes up fairly high on populism measures. And one of the reasons, of course, is that he was meant to kind of be an agent of change, right? He came in with this idea that he was going to create prosperity for everybody, right? In other words, it was going to not be, the China of the wild 1980s and 1990s, but it was going to be a different China. Okay. And in that situation, of course, that becomes very much around capturing state assets, making those, leveraging those state assets and making them go forward, right? Because you can't do it all by bureaucratic fiat. Certainly, it is in Mao's China. Okay, it's a different China. Okay, with kind of a mixed economic structure of state ownership and not state ownership. In the case of Teddy Roosevelt, of course, he was going the opposite direction, right? He was trying to force more of the kind of government agenda by breaking up trust and doing other sorts of things like that, which were meant to regulate the businesses. But I think what you see in the United States is you see the opposite occurring, right? And that is that big money from very specific types of interest have gone into um, uh, Trump's win. And what that meant is that there's going to be a quid pro quo, whether people say there isn't a quid pro quo or not. You don't spend $125 million and not expect a return on that investment. Okay, you also have a blurring of these, the lines between, okay, what's government activity and what isn't government activity, right? If you have, in certain sorts of cases, I won't bring Turkey up as an example, right? But you have, I think it's the son of Erdogan who he's got his own private operations, right? Then you see that Don Jr. now is going to work for a venture capital company or a private equity firm. How does all this work out? Okay, so I think that there's a real issue, not of state capture of economic assets, which was what happened in China, right? But private economic assets capturing governmental assets. And that always kind of reminds me, of an old quote by Ambrose Bierce. Many people know the Devil's Dictionary, right? And he defines politics as a strife of interest masquerading as a contest of principles. Okay, the conduct of public affairs for private advantage. Okay, and I think we're seeing what you see with many of these the populists, is one of their attempts to maintain their position in their power is to align with financial interests, which would make them be able to stay in power. Because in some sense, they don't have a long-term agenda. Typically, most populists don't have long-term agendas. Okay, and therefore they have to kind of rely on, um, something supporting them, going forward, right? And I think in the United States we see that movement, but we're used to seeing it in places like Turkey or maybe India or Indonesia or the Philippines or all these other places, right? What we're seeing is we're seeing that in the United States right now. I mean, we're seeing that sort of same thing, which has occurred in many other countries, um, kind of now finding its way into, um, the most economic powerful democracy in the world.
Interesting. Yeah, there's the interesting question from Carlos Cordova Chea,
Yeah.
relating the populist agendas to the current troubles of the higher education system in the UK, financial exigencies, financial crisis faced in the higher education system. There is a corollary in the US too. In the US, we're seeing significant declines in enrollment. I'm sure you're following that by four-year colleges, and either high school graduates skipping going to college or turning to vocational technical schools, community colleges. Something like 40 states across the United States now offer free tuition.
Yeah.
So financially speaking, there's a big incentive too, a big attraction towards the 1 year, 2 year kind of a degree. from a community college, technical college, versus spending 4 or 5 years and paying,
Yeah.
higher and higher tuition to universities. So many liberal arts colleges have shut down their doors.
Yeah.
I guess this underlying current in the new generation, these high school graduates, is there a relationship to the populist movements either in the US or UK? What do you think about that, Tim?
Yeah, I don't even have to speculate on that because I don't necessarily have
Yeah,
any data or primary work I could fall back on.
yeah,
I think that there's kind of a different aspect in many of these countries, right? And that is that the old model was that a small part of your population went to university. They went into very specific types of roles: engineers, lawyers, judges, doctors, and so on down the line. And business schools, if we would go back, 35, 40 years, right? Business schools were actually a small part of university education, in terms of the percent of students who were studying, say, business compared to engineering or medicine or law or other sorts of things of that nature. Now, business students are like 60% plus of most universities, right? They're very, very, very large on it. And I think that part of that is commensurate with the nature of where the returns to certain activities are. So I think that's part of it. But the other part of it is that instead of 30% of your population going to university education and then some other percent doing technical training or apprenticeships and doing other sorts of things of that nature, and still being able to earn an income which materially makes your life good, right? Um, it's now going the other way, right? It's going where 70% of your population goes to university, right? And what that means is the universities have to kind of have a way of providing them with a return on what it is that they're getting in terms of the nature of graduation. If the job market is very tight, if the cost of that education is now a significantly higher portion of your lifetime earnings, right? Then you want to achieve a much quicker return than you would otherwise want to achieve. And I think that what you see certainly, and this is what I've seen in a number of papers and other things, that the individuals who don't go to university look at this and sort of say, well, if I spend X thousands of dollars for 4 years of university education, what does that really get me? Because now to differentiate yourself, you got to go to graduate school, you got to get an MBA, you've got to get a grad, some other degrees, right? Which means that maybe it's 6 years, right? And 6 years at $200,000 or whatever, right? Plus the opportunity cost of time that you've lost. People look on it and just simply say, I'm much better off if I, you know, do something for which I can start to earn, a kind of decent income or early on. And so I think that part of it is related to that cost structure and how that's changing it and the nature of those returns. But also, I think that the universities themselves have simply not kept up with the nature of the skill development that's needed by 21st century graduates. So and you see this, right? Because the universities get saddled with, why do liberal arts colleges go bankrupt and MIT and Carnegie Mellon and Case Western and Caltech seem to be doing really well? Because programmers make a lot of money. Engineers still make a lot of money, right? But for the average person coming through, saying in wanting to spend 4 years doing an arts degree, the returns on that are simply going to be, really catastrophically low for those individuals, and so therefore they might go off and really try something else. And also, there's this dissatisfaction, I think, with going through the corporate path, right? We all see this in our MBA and undergraduate. Most people don't want to work for companies long term. They want to work for themselves. So entrepreneurship becomes very big, not because entrepreneurship is such a uniquely sexy thing to do. It's uniquely different in the sense that you are owner and boss, or you are responsible for taking your own risks, and you can win and lose. Whereas if you go through the corporate cycle, you're going to spend years and years and years moving up the pole of the corporate endeavor. But if the corporations are continuously engaging in downsizing, what's the likelihood that you're going to be able to make it up through the path that maybe your father or your grandfather or your mother or your grandmother had worked? My mother worked for Mellon Bank for 50 years. Okay. Nobody works for companies for 50 years, right? It just doesn't happen. Okay. So I think that whole economic structural change around that simply means that the universities are not really putting people in the position that says, this is going to give you a head start, or this is really going to add to your economic value, and potentially not even to your social and psychological value, because the stress and everything, we hear all the issues of mental health, and so this becomes a disaffected group. And I think that was seen in the U.S. election, where surprisingly, the college students did not vote in the big democratic wave that people thought they were going to vote.
Yeah, definitely. A very good discussion, conversation. Really enjoyed. We just have a few minutes allotted. Tim, maybe I can ask you for some final comments, and maybe ask you to speculate a little bit with respect to the future of the populism. I mean, is this here to stay? And we're going to have to find more and more cases, political parties and leaders hanging on to this ideology, or what do you think will happen in the near future?
Well, I think that the one thing that we didn't really kind of get into in something that I've continuously argued, and that is that populism in and of itself, the political battles that you see, the kind of political street fighting and all the political strategies you see, none of this stuff is new. None of this stuff is new or earth-shattering. Right? I think the people have become a bit complacent from a general population standpoint, in terms of the way politics have evolved over, say, 25 to 30 years. But it does follow waves, right? I mean, there was, take the United States as an example, right? There were Andrew Jackson. There were big waves of populism around Andrew Jackson, right? There was the Know Nothing Party. There were all sorts of other. There was the American Party. There were all sorts of kind of populist fringe groups which were around, right? Williams Jennings Bryan pops up. Theodore Roosevelt pops up. You get Father Coughlin, right? You get Huey Long. You get all of these things going up over time, right? And they do follow waves. Right. And the reason is that the politicians are flawed human beings. In other words, we see this with companies, right? Companies are born, companies do well, and companies die, or they're born and die pretty quickly, right? So there are political waves, right? There are times when the stars align for certain political agendas, and then the stars change, and these political agendas become stale. Right. And we saw this in the United Kingdom, right? You have 10 years of Tony Blair, you get 10 years of the Tories, right, which was a bit of a mess towards the end, right? You then get, we're probably going to get another 10 years of Labour. You had Angela Merkel for many years, which looked stable, right? You had Kohl, right? You had periods of time when that political structure, it was going between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, right? Now it's a bit upset, right? So I think a lot of this is really a wave, but certainly the thing that is true is the nature of political competition is very different. The nature, it used to be, the way you got yourself elected, was advertising, being with the media, getting newspapers to endorse you, right? Doing, getting the political machine to endorse you, right? Now, it's podcasts, right? It's things like this. It's podcasts. It's social media, right? It's
Right.
completely different
Mhm.
means by which um, voice gets into the system. And I think that in the United States in particular, the Republican Party, even though it looked like it wasn't kind of doing a good job, it played a far savvier hand with respect to things like ignore the media, go on to Joe Rogan's podcast, right? Stick with the social media agenda, really push that, right? It was the Democrats simply were not prepared for that, and they didn't do it. The next time along, they will be prepared for that, right? I mean, you would hope they would be prepared for that, but it will also change too, right? We don't know where the social media environment's going to go in the future. We don't know how all this is going to evolve and change. So I think that it might be a period of instability, but again, I would make an argument if I was going to prognosticate that there are going to be waves to this, and different forms of political orientations are going to pop up. And the United States is very unique in having the Republican Party and the Democratic Party for donkey's years. I mean, if you look in Europe, I mean, political parties pop up and die all the time. And maybe we need in the United States, maybe they need more political parties, right? Maybe they need new political parties. So I think
Yes.
you have to kind of look at it that way and sort of say, if you look at it in a larger span of history, we've seen something like this before. Yeah, this is a little different, but we know the only thing we know is we know it's going to change. We know it's going to be
Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
And it's cyclical. Yeah.
it is
Well,
cyclical.
this has been a fascinating discussion, Tim. I really appreciate it. I'm sure our participants appreciate it as well. We had a good number of people join us from all over the world. We thank them and we invite them to our next webinar, which is already on our website, I believe. So, Tim, I'm going to ask you, I should have asked you earlier if I can share some of your writings, papers on populism. Maybe you can send me an email and we'll send the list
Sure.
to our everybody who signed up and joined us today.
Yeah.
So
No,
thank you so much, Tim, and thank you all for joining us. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you at the next cyber webinar. Take care.